Hey, today I want to talk to you about systemic problems. And systemic problems are very different than just regular problems in society. Systemic problems are problems that are caused due to issues inherent with the overall system rather than due to an individual specific isolated factor. And thus, systemic problems are much harder to get rid of from your society, and they have much broader effects on the society themselves. Systemic problems are often topics of debate motions, and so it's really important as a debater to understand systemic problems. This is a little bit more of an advanced debate lecture, and so if you're just learning debate, this is probably not going to be as helpful to you. Hey Emily!
My speech just got roasted by these college students and I just got cooked so bad. I genuinely wanted to start crying. I was like, oh my god, and I did not know what I was saying.
Another inherent aspect of systemic problems is that they tend to continue to grow due to the fact that they have compounding impacts that grow over time. And the only way to get rid of a systemic problem is a large structural change through policy or through concerted effort, a revolutionary change that can root the systemic problem out of your society. There's 4 examples of systemic problems that come to mind. Systemic racism, the wealth gap, maybe the prison industrial complex, and perpetual war. All 4 of these problems can be found worldwide, but they're all 4 problems that can also be found in the United States. So we're going to talk about each of these problems and why they're systemic and possibly how these might be solved. But first we have to define each of these things. So systemic racism. Systemic racism is a set of institutional, historical, cultural, and interpersonal practices within society that puts one social or ethnic group in a better position to succeed than the others. Very often, systemic racism can start with history. History that has long, echoing impacts for decades and hundreds of years. So a very good example of this is the Jim Crow laws and redlining from American history against African Americans in America. And the impacts of the economic disparity due to Jim Crow laws and redlining has echoed on in time perpetually until the status quo. So that is an example of systemic racism and how systemic racism can be a perpetual problem that grows and echoes throughout time. In a similar vein, the wealth gap is another systemic problem. Again, that is rooted back in history. If your ancestors owned land, you are more likely to own land now. If your ancestors went to a better university and got degrees, you are more likely to have gotten a degree. And so the wealth gap is a perpetual problem which is enabled by the system to continue allowing people to either find themselves in poverty or find themselves in wealth. Furthermore, the political incentive of a lot of capitalist countries is to continue power amongst those who already have it. Political power is often gained by the people who have the most donations and have the most campaign funds, and so often power that rests at the top of capitalist and democratic nations will continue to rest at the top. This is probably also the same for autocratic nations as well. And due to capital markets and how capital markets work, having money begetting more money, the systemic problem of the wealth gap continues to perpetuate due to stock markets and due to interest being favorable to those who already have capital. The inverse is true for poor people as well. Due to inflation and due to the fact that wages don't increase as fast as the stock market, poor people will perpetually be poorer as they go on. So the wealth gap is a systemic problem that continues to make rich people richer and poor people poorer. Another example of a systemic problem is the prison industrial complex. The United States is a very good example of this because the United States has that for-profit private prison system that a lot of countries do not have. The prison industrial complex is the systemic problem of growing prison population and recidivism. Recidivism is basically the likelihood of a prisoner going back to prison once they've gone there in the first place. So committing another crime as soon as they leave and coming back into prison. And the recidivism rate for the United States is one of the highest recidivism rates in the world, making this a systemic problem, one that continues to grow and echo throughout time. And also, with the criminal justice system, you are a lot more likely to become a criminal if your father or your mother was a criminal in the first place. One of the reasons why this prison industrial complex continues to grow is due to the for-profit incentives that these prison systems have to continue to have more and more prisoners. Why? Because they make money for every prisoner that is within the industrial complex. Last but not least is perpetual war. And perpetual war, also known as the military-industrial complex, is the state of growing military funding in a constant state of war. Again, just like in the wealth gap, there is a political incentive for policy to reflect the will of the donors. And due to the military-industrial complex being so wealthy, they are able to lobby for more war and for more use of their products. This is also called the iron triangle of the military-industrial complex, where military contractors will give more donations to Congress that will pass legislation to fund the Department of Defense, and the Department of Defense giving profits to military contractors, creating this triangle. Of course, systemic problems aren't as simple as what I just described them as. Yes, there are for-profit incentives. Yes, the system of capitalism and the system of democracy is what perpetuates all of these problems. However, it's not just as simple as that. The thing to learn with systemic issues and the systemic problems is that these problems are inbuilt into the systems, and therefore the systems need radical change. Right? For us to get rid of the wealth gap, there needs to be radical change in legislation that is able to give more money to the poor, that is able to tax the rich enough. To get rid of systemic racism, there needs to be a more radical change that allows us to get rid of the racism within the system. Note that not any one actor in a systemically racist system needs to be racist. However, all you need to be doing is feeling the echoes of a systemically racist past. Very often at the heart of a lot of these systemic problems, though, is the for-profit incentives. So as a debater, if you want to make changes, big changes within the society and change the status quo, you need to tackle the for-profit incentives. The for-profit incentives of the prison industrial complex, the for-profit incentives of the military industrial complex. And thus, if you're proposing for a motion that wants to create radical change, you need to talk about the fact that these problems are big, wide-ranging, and that they perpetuate themselves, that they continue to grow. I can make an entire video on each of these systemic problems, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what large systemic problems there are in society and how we can approach these topics in debate. So as a whole, systemic problems can't be rooted out with just moderate or simple policy change. You need to have a more radical change in order to root out systemic problems. Also, I have an entire slideshow and lecture on how the status quo is great and how we're going to achieve this change without making radical change. I am not personally one of those proponents of huge change in society. Just this is very important for understanding proposition side and a lot of debate. So yeah, are you against systemic problems? Are you for radical change? Are you against for-profit incentives? This is something you have to do very often in debates by understanding systemic problems and how they perpetuate over time and grow. Thanks for listening to my lecture, and hopefully I can do another speech about how the status quo is okay.